Inflation has cooled. In March, the reading came in at 5.3%. That's down from a 4-month high of 5.6% the previous month. The moderation is as a result of softer price increases across several CPI categories, such as food and transport. The print follows a decision by the Reserve Bank last month to keep rates on hold. The SARB says its policy stance needs to remain restrictive to tackle higher inflation expectations. The bank forecasts that headline inflation will reach the midpoint of its target range of 4.5% only near the end of next year. Retail activity has dipped again. Sales fell by 0.8% in February. This marks the second consecutive month of decline, largely due to significant drops in sales of textiles, clothing, footwear and leather goods. Investex chief economist Annabel Bishop says consumers are financially constrained and are still typically battling with the extra spend over the festive season. Motorists will feel the pinch at petrol pumps next month. Data from the Central Energy Fund shows that petrol will cost around 37 cents a litre more in May. This is based on preliminary figures, and the Motormobile Association has warned that with tensions ramping up in the Middle East, the rand could come under significant pressure in the last 2 weeks of this month, and that could still significantly impact local fuel prices. The one silver lining from the current data is that diesel users will have some respite. The cost of that fuel is expected to decrease by 35 cents a litre, and that should help inflation as it won't lead to higher input costs across various sectors. The New Development Bank says a process is underway to find a successor to Leslie Maasdorp. He is currently Vice President, CFO and Debt Officer of the NDB, and his term expires on July the 7th. The NDB, formerly known as the BRICS Development Bank, was set up in 2015, and Maasdorp was named by South Africa to represent the country at the institution. He was then appointed by the bank to the role of CFO. Cabinet says it will announce Maasdorp's replacement after the recruitment process has been completed. Motors has announced a changing of the guard. The automotive CEO Osman Arbi will retire at the end of October, and current CFO Okert Janse van Rensburg will take up the position. Janse van Rensburg held the CEO position in an acting capacity for 6 months when Arbi was ill, and the board says it is looking forward to working with him to grow the company. The process to find a suitable replacement for the CFO position has begun, and the company says it will update shareholders on this once an appointment has been made. Inzimbi has warned of a profit plunge. The small-cap metal alloy supplier expects a drop in annual earnings of as much as 60%. That's partly due to a challenging economic and operational environment in the second half of the firm's financial year. Apart from port and logistical challenges, the company also cited the effects of lower than expected commodity prices, high interest rates, protracted periods of load shedding, and the ban on exports of recycled metals. Inzimbi will publish results on the 31st of May. De Beers has sold $445 million worth of diamonds in its third cycle. This is more than what was sold in the second cycle, but is down significantly on what was sold in the same period last year. The Anglo-American firm says many diamond businesses are continuing to take a cautious approach to purchases amid the uncertain economic landscape and the slow pace of growth in China. Now, trade tensions between China and the EU persist. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is unleashing a barrage of trade restrictions against China, aiming to tackle unfair trade practices that are said to be contributing to social and political challenges for the bloc. Here's our reporter Anati Ndevu with more.
Well, that's right, Zinati. In the latest long simmering trade tensions between the EU and China, the European Union is looking to back against what it calls assertive trade practices from China. Now, the EU officials are reportedly set to launch another round of investigations of Chinese products. And joining us, of course, with the latest is Deutsche Welle's Cassandra Sant, who is currently standing by in Berlin. Cassandra, there's reportedly stepped up efforts from the EU against, quote, unfair trade practices from China. What's happening?
Well, thanks for having me. And that's right, EU leaders are putting the final touches on something they're calling a competitiveness deal that's reportedly coming out this week. The document highlights in particular that the bloc is facing increasingly assertive policy measures by its rivals, particularly when it comes to subsidies. The idea that the European Union isn't competing on a level playing field with China was echoed by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz while he was in China this week. During his visit, Scholz pushed for China to treat foreign companies better, saying, quote, competition must be fair. But while he was pushing for fairer treatment, Scholz was also advocating specifically for German industry. He pressed the case for China to guarantee German firms equal market access, the protection of intellectual property, and a reliable legal system. So, stepping back, EU officials really feel that the game is rigged against European businesses. There have been several investigations into Chinese-made goods like electric vehicles, wind and solar parks, and even railway firms. The next inquiry to launch is likely to be China's procurement of medical devices. Now, this deluge of investigations is a sign that the EU is increasingly asserting itself against China, threatening restrictive trade measures that could result in tariffs, which could cut China off from European markets and maybe even spark a trade war. Now, that's a lot of coulds, but the EU's competition chief said that the bloc is catching on to the Chinese playbook, adding, quote, knowing that you have been played teaches you that you need to watch out.
Well, Cassandra, the EU has a big goal to slash its CO2 emissions, but will limiting which greener tech options a company can buy have the adverse effect of hampering progress towards the CO2 reduction goal?
Well, the area of clean tech is where the EU is most fervently fighting against cheap Chinese imports. Despite EU investments in the industry, China has come to dominate the market over the past decade, with their domestic industries buoyed by massive support from the state. For example, in the wind sector, companies are able to sell products about 20% cheaper than their European and US peers. So there are two stances from the EU that might be at odds here. The first is this EU goal to slash its carbon emissions by 55% this decade. The bloc is already off track there. The other piece is the so-called Net Zero Industry Act, which was put forward last year and requires that 40% of the EU's clean tech needs to be produced domestically. Now, the aim there is to rival an enormous support package from the US, which was passed 2 years ago. So there are concerns that these two goals, turning to greener tech as soon as possible and getting tech made in the EU, are at odds. And the EU competition chief, Margrethe Vestager, has warned that Europe's EVs and chip sector could go the way of the European solar panel. After all, the European Union lost out on that industry, even though it invested heavily in the tech over a decade ago. Today, 9 out of every 10 solar panels are produced in China.
Now, in addition to the climate concerns you make mention of, Cassandra, would it be safe to say that some EU officials are tying these unfair practices to some political discontent within the EU? Maybe you can unpack that for us.
That's right. There seems to be a bit of a connecting some dots here from the EU side. This concern isn't just on the fringes of the EU political discourse either. Most recently, it seems coming from former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi. He argued the case that essentially China's trade abuses are at the heart of the biggest social and political problems that have plagued Europe and the US over the past 2 decades. In his speech several weeks ago, Draghi said that people justifiably feel, quote, that they have been left behind, and that the lack of international rules and dispute settlements have created unfair competition, and he says that's caused them to turn against democratic values.
Well, let's leave it there for now. We'll be watching those developments quite closely. Thank you so much for your time. That was DW's Cassandra Sant.